This is Barry Roberts. He's my grandfather. So my mom's dad. He's my mom's dad, and he's the one who I'm going to be interviewing today. So let's get to the first question.
Okay, Maya, I'm glad to be a part of your interview. Okay?
Were you in a war? If so, which one?
Okay, Maya, I was not actually in a war. I was in the Army during the Vietnam War. I did not actually fight in the Vietnam War. Here's my hat that I wore in my dress uniform. Now, you do have ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War, in the Civil War, World War I, and World War II.
Okay.
Oh, and I also might add, Maya, you have ancestry that goes back to Charlemagne.
Okay. So how would you describe your childhood?
My childhood was moving a great deal because my dad was in the military. In fact, my dad was in World War II. He was in the Army in the Korean War, and he was in the Vietnam War. But my childhood was spent moving a good bit because he was in the military, and we would spend 2 or 3 years at one place and then move to another place. I was actually born in the Panama Canal Zone when he was stationed there on one of his assignments. And later he returned there, and I have many fond memories of spending of going from the first grade through the middle of the 4th grade in the Panama Canal Zone. Later we moved to Texas and went to several schools there in Texas. And then later we moved to Choctaw County, Alabama, back to the home place, and spent the rest of my childhood, and I graduated from high school in Choctaw County, Alabama. I guess that sort of describes my childhood.
So, like, where did you work besides, like, in the military?
Oh, where did I work besides being in the military? I spent most of my work career working in the U.S. Civil Service, working for the Army and the Department of Defense, work in Washington, D.C., let's see, in St. Louis, Missouri, Fort Rucker, Alabama, and I eventually retired working for the Department of Defense. Actually retired at Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, and so that's kind of sums up where I worked, and I really enjoyed that kind of work, working for our country, the Defense Department, and the military.
So,
Why don't you tell a little bit about the postal building that you used to work in Washington D.C. and
Okay.
what that is now?
Sure. Before I worked for the Department of Defense, I worked in Washington, D.C. for 7 years for the Department of Energy. And you may have heard about the old post office building. I worked in that building for a number of years before it went through the renovation that it has gone through more recently. And I have very fond memories of working in the old post office building in Washington, D.C. And that was really a fun time in my career working for civil service. Okay?
so, did your parents do anything important, like, I don't know, like, fight in the, didn't your, like, father fight in the war?
Okay, did my parents do anything important? Yes. Well, first of all, before I really get into that question, the most important thing that my parents did was to raise me, my brother, and sister. There is nothing more important than being a parent and raising your children in the right way. That was the very most important thing they did. While my dad was in the Army during World War II, he was stationed actually in Iran, His job was to unload what they call lend-lease supplies off of ships there in Iran at that time and load them onto the railroad to be sent up to Russia as lend-lease supplies. He spent a number of years there doing that. It doesn't sound like it might be really important to do that, but something we have to realize is that during World War II, many families of soldiers, the families that were back home, of soldiers that were off in the war, were not allowed to know where they were. So for a number of years, my mother did not know where my father was during World War II. Your grandmother, Graham's father, Mr. McBrayer, was in the South Pacific during World War II, and for many years, Graham's mom did not know where he was. It wasn't till about the time the war was over and he came home that she was permitted to know where he was. I thought that was very interesting, and that was a real sacrifice on their part to go off and be in the war, and their families not really know where they were. It's much different nowadays, but back then, that's kind of the way that was. Okay?
That's all my questions.
Can I just add one more thing, if I may, Maya? I know you didn't ask this question, but what you might want to remember in later years is that all your ancestors that came before you had a great deal to do with who you are today. Because of the kind of people that they were, that makes you the person you are. And I'm very grateful for all of my ancestors, many of whom I never even saw. Many of them died way before I was born. But they were the right kind of people. They raised their families in the right way, with the right values. And so that's why it's so important to understand where we came from, our legacy, our ancestors, the people that came before us, and realize what a debt we owe to them because of what they did to make us who we are today. And thank you, Maya, for interviewing me for your project.
And
Okay?
thank you for letting me interview you.
It was a pleasure and it was an honor. Thank you, Maya.